Hello, Malcolm Brady of Dublin City University here again to talk to you today about um, some external analysis techniques. So we're in the analysis stage of the strategy course, purpose, analysis, choice, execution. So we're looking at analysis and we're still looking at external analysis, in other words, analysis of factors outside the firm. And you can see here, we're straight away going to start with one of the best known techniques out there, Porter's five force analysis or industry analysis framework. We'll also look at strategic groups and key success factors. So they're the three elements for today's session. So Porter's five forces, as I said, it's an industry analysis technique, and that's the first thing to note, industry level analysis. So this isn't a technique you use to analyze a single firm. For example, you don't do a five force analysis of Tesco or of Walmart or of Google or of Microsoft or of Bank of Ireland. Okay, you do a five force analysis of the retail grocery industry or the banking industry or the mortgage industry or whatever the industry it is you're looking at. That's the level of analysis, not a single firm. Okay, so it's important to get that right. Otherwise, you'll be analyzing the wrong kind of things and using the tool in the wrong kind of way. So you can see here it's five forces, so it's made up of five elements: threat of new entrants, threat of substitutes, supplier power, buyer power, and rivalry among the incumbents in the industry. Okay, so the first thing you need to be sure of is be clear on what industry you're actually analyzing. That's the critical thing, and that's not always as easy as it seems. It can be difficult in certain industries to actually define the industry. Okay, it's probably useful to consider what geography you're looking at as well, because the forces that play in, for example, Ireland, where I am at the moment, could be quite different to the forces that play in the USA. Okay, so important to define your geography. And we looked at economic characteristics and we looked at geographic scope of the industry. And here you probably carry out the five forces within the geographic scope that's relevant to the industry you're looking at. All right, so we'll start with the threat of new entrants, because this, in a sense, disciplines the industry. If the industry is becoming very profitable and very attractive, other firms would be attracted in. This is the law or the underpinning of perfect competition. If the industry is attractive, other firms will come in and compete in that industry, and that will then tend to bring profitability down to normal levels. Okay, reduce or eliminate supernormal profits. So threat of new entrants is critical here. And we weigh that up in two ways. First of all, what are the barriers to entry? In other words, what's stopping firms entering the industry? And the second thing is the reaction of the incumbents, because again, if there's a very strong reaction from incumbents to new entrants, that tends to put new entrants off. We talked about this before when we were looking at offensive and defensive strategies. So incumbents can set up a defensive strategy to eliminate or reduce the possibility of new entrants coming. And part of that is to have much cash in the industry available for retaliation should a new entrant arrive in. Okay, so that's the level of response. That's it's critical to kind of work out what the general response is by the incumbents. And the second thing is the barriers to entry, and these can be of many kinds. Patents, for example, increase a barrier to entry. Large marketing expenditures increase a barrier to entry. Suppliers and so on being tied up by the incumbents increases the barrier to entry. And then there are what Porter calls factors irrespective of size. For example, just having the best locations already occupied can be a barrier to entry. If, for example, all the good locations on the high street or in town or in the city centre, let's say, are already occupied, it makes it hard for a new entrant to get in because they have to find a new premises and create a new area, for example, of commerce possibly, and that can be difficult. So those are factors putting off new entrants. Okay. On the other side, on the bottom of this, the diagram, then threat of substitutes. Well, this again, substitutes are products or supplies or services provided by another industry that can substitute for the products of the industry you're in. Okay, so the substitutes are not another type of competitor in the same industry. We look at that under rivalry among the incumbents. Substitutes are from a different industry altogether. So it's important to think of that because it forces you to think widely. So, for example, contact lenses may be a substitute to eyeglasses or spectacles. Or taking it even further, restaurants can be a substitute for cinema or theatre if the service provided, say, is entertainment or a night out or feeling good. Okay, obviously, if the service provided is theatre entertainment, well, it's hard to provide alternatives to that, except maybe buskers on the outside or whatever may be a substitute for that. Okay, in terms of cinema, again, if it's to do with movie going, well, a substitute to cinema, to the cinema industry, it would be, for example, Netflix or home cinema. Again, a different delivery system, but provides a substitute for the product or service that's provided by the industry. So it's important, again, to work out what the service provided by the industry is. If it's simply a movie, that's one thing. If it's actually entertainment, that broadens the industry out and, in a sense, increases the possibility of other substitutes that you mightn't even be aware of. Okay, so they're the threat of substitutes. And then we have supplier power and buyer power. Now, again, it's important to understand what Porter means by suppliers and what he means by buyers. By suppliers, he means the suppliers of the components that the industry uses to deliver its product or service. Okay, so supplier of the raw materials or the raw components. Okay, and buyers are obviously the people who purchase the products of the industry. And there may be multiple layers of buyers. In other words, the buyer might initially be a wholesaler, and then it might be a retailer, and then it might be finally a consumer. Okay, so there might be several layers of buyers. Again, it's important to understand that. And there can be different kinds of buyers. There can be a few large buyers, for example, government or whatever, or there can be many, many small buyers, as in ordinary consumers. Okay. So just come back to supplier power buyer power and supplier power have parallels in terms of what influences them. So first of all, if there are relatively small numbers of buyers or indeed suppliers, that tends to increase the power of buyers or suppliers over the industry. So if you have 3 or 4 large suppliers and a large number of, say, small incumbents, well, that increases the power of suppliers over the industry. Similarly, if you have 3 or 4 large buyers, that increases the power of the buyers over the industry. So, for example, in terms of suppliers, Microsoft and, say, Intel are very large suppliers to the computer industry, to the laptop industry, say. So those suppliers, have a great deal of power over the industry. And if you look at the price you pay for a laptop, much of the value of that, much of the price is going to Intel and to Microsoft for the operating system and the microprocessor, respectively. Sorry, the other way around, I think. The microprocessor price goes to Intel, and the operating system price goes to Microsoft. But either way, the two big suppliers are getting the lion's share of the value out of that industry. On the other hand, you can have very big buyers. For example, Walmart would be a very big buyer of, or the large multiples, Tesco, Walmart, Aldi, Lidl in Ireland. Those companies are large buyers for the fruit and vegetable industry, who tend to be very many small farmers or small producers. So those very large multiples have a great deal of power over those those incumbent firms in that particular industry. So again, it's important to know what industry you're looking at, be clear on that, and then be clear on the buyer, who are the buyers of the industry and who are the suppliers to the industry. Other features that tend to affect buyer power and supplier power, as is mentioned already, the number of firms, also the type of component or product being purchased. If it's highly differentiated, that tends to increase the supplier power, for example, because the incumbents are very dependent on that particular item, component, and therefore that tends to shift power in the way of suppliers. Similarly, if the industry produces a very differentiated product, that tends to increase its power over the buyers, because the buyers are, wanted a particular differentiated product, and therefore they will have to pay more for it, and it shifts power towards the incumbent firms. Similarly, if there's a high threat of integration, for example, if the suppliers can integrate forward, we'll have a look at the moment in a moment at milk producers in Ireland, and if those milk producers can integrate forward into the milk processing industry, that increases their power. In this particular case, they can't, because to get into milk processing requires huge scale in terms of putting pasteurization facilities and bottling facilities and so on, which ordinary farmers don't have the capability of. So in that case, that tends to shift power towards the incumbents and away from the suppliers. So similarly, if buyers can integrate backwards and produce the goods themselves, for example, if McDonald's ever, as a buyer of, say, beef, if it ever felt it wasn't getting good value from the beef producers, say in Ireland, well, it could set up its own farms, integrate backwards into producing its own beef. Okay, and if that's credible, then that increases the buyer power over the incumbent firms. Okay, so the level of differentiation, or the antithesis of that, is the level of standardization of products, the credibility of forward or backward integration, the number of suppliers, number of buyers, and we haven't mentioned yet, but switching costs is another key factor in determining the buyer power or the supplier power. For example, if buyers can easily switch between one vendor and another, that increases the buyer power over the incumbent firms. So, for example, cars, if you can switch easily between a Volvo and a Toyota, which you can, that tends to increase the buyer power over the incumbent firms. Okay, so switching costs, credibility of forward or backward integration, the number of suppliers, and level of differentiation or standardization of products. All of these influence the buyer and supplier power. So it's important to look at those. I mentioned those characteristics already when we talked about economic characteristics a couple of sessions ago. And you can see how they feature now in the 5-force analysis, where you're looking at a specific industry and the nature of the power of the different elements over that industry. The final force is the rivalry among the incumbents. And Porter here said, and this is often the largest force, if incumbents are quite competitive within the industry, and this tends to be the case if there's a relatively, not so much a large number of incumbents, but a large-ish number of equally sized incumbents, that tends to make the industry quite competitive. If there's only one or two who tend to dominate the industry can have a, let's call it a way of working that allows the two large firms a great deal of influence or control over the industry. And if it's very, very many, if it's very fragmented, there's obviously competition at local level, but no one dominant firm, so not necessarily any huge economies of scale available to any of the incumbents, which tends to reduce the level of competition taking place there. Yeah, so that's our 5th force, and you're looking at all of those forces and you're weighing up, in a sense, broadly, are they high, medium, or low? And if the forces are generally high, if all 5 forces are high in that industry, or the threats are high, then that would tend to make that industry relatively unattractive. And Porter, if you look at the quote or the reference there at the bottom in his 2008 paper, he gives a whole series of industries and indicates levels of attractiveness or levels of profitability of the industry. You can see some industries have relatively low sets of forces and they tend to be profitable industries. Pharmaceutical comes towards the top of his list. Other industries tend to have quite high forces impinging on the industry. For example, the airline industry, and that industry tends not to be very profitable. So you're looking at, say, the profit margins in this case. Okay, so low profit margins in the airline industry, high margins in the pharmaceutical industry. And Porter suggests that the 5-force analysis is relatively long-lasting, and it was, it's obviously a snapshot in time, but these forces don't tend to change too quickly, so it gives a good picture of the industry. His work came out initially in 1980, so the technique itself has stood the test of time. It's 40 years in going at the moment, so it's stood the test of time. I have two examples of the five forces in action. We've this one here from the, as I mentioned already, the milk industry in Ireland. And you can see here farmers are getting 33 cents per litre of milk. This is 2002, although it hasn't changed much. I'm speaking in 2020, and it hasn't changed much from that. And consumers are paying around 98 cents per litre for milk again in 2002, but again, not that different in 2020. So you can see here the farmers are getting they don't feel generally that they get a good deal in this particular industry. So you can see the profit, the incumbent firms, the big milk producers in Ireland, have strong level of power over this industry. Power implying the ability to get the price you want or to get the conditions you want from whoever you're dealing with. So the incumbents can get a good deal from the milk producers, the farmers. So that's really what Porter means by power. It's the ability to negotiate on price or negotiate on terms with your fellow industry, or with the either suppliers or buyers of your industry. Okay, a second example is going to be, you can see it's the pig, it'll be the pig industry in Ireland, and you can just, I'll read down through this. This is 2015, so not too long ago. And the Irish Farmers Association held a protest accusing pig meat processors of opportunistic price cuts that are leaving pig farmers facing ruin. However, processors hit back, claiming they were paying more than the average European price. And the IFA said that the latest price cuts were unwarranted and factories couldn't blame some outside factor, the Russian import ban. There's opportunism evident here, and this is absolutely unacceptable. And they also called for the feed sector, who are their suppliers in turn, to lower costs, as happened in other EU countries. So you can see a sort of chain of forces here. The pig producers are complaining about their suppliers who are charging too much for feed, and they're complaining about their buyers, who are the pig producers, who are not paying enough for pig meat. So you can see here on the right-hand side, there's 200 pig producers in Ireland, but there's 4 pig meat processors, so a small number of firms in the industry, large number of pig producers. Farmers estimate a break-even price of 1.62, but farmers representative said that the farmers produce a commodity and are therefore price takers. Now, obviously, this is a statement, and in fact, it's a statement of the five forces approach, or one of the factors that I mentioned earlier in five forces. If you're producing a commodity or a standardized product, in other words, a non-differentiated product, you don't have much ability to negotiate on price. So you are a price taker. So that's a fact. And that's really the five forces model in action. Obviously the pig farmers here don't like it, but that's the nature of the five forces model. A good five force analysis would tell them that they have actually fairly low power in this industry, given current conditions of standardized products, large number of producers, dependent entirely on these 4 meat processors for their for their sales. They've no other alternatives. So this is the five forces in action. You can see here the producers have quite a deal of power over the suppliers, in this case the pig farmers. Now, that's enough about the industry level five forces analysis, looking at profitability of the industry. I'm going to look at a second model now, which is strategic group maps. And this is really, it's a more detailed level in the sense that you're now looking at specific firms. At the five forces level, you're not necessarily looking at specific firms, but here in strategic groups, you are looking at specific firms. So you're identifying the firms in the industry, and it's a clustering technique. You're trying to group them up into relevant clusters. And you do that by choosing 2 dimensions by which you can cluster these firms, or these firms. So use dimensions that expose differences among the firms, and, for example, use the key success factors in the industry. That's their dimensions that you've already identified as critical for the industry, key for success. And, for example, product line breadth, or level of vertical integration, or level of use of technology, and so on. Okay, they're just examples. And then you plot each firm. You rate each firm on each dimension, and then you plot each firm on your 2x2 matrix. And you can use the area, you can use the area of a circle, the area of the plot to represent the size of the firm. So this area of the circle represents the size of the firm in terms of sales, for example. Although many of the strategic group maps don't just simply use a dot, they don't use the area of the circle, but that gives further information, so it can be useful. Firms then tend to compete within the groups. You can see here grouping up in the top right corner, Anheuser-Busch and Miller competing strongly against each other, and then others really competing in separate clusters, the boutique cluster and maybe the other bottom left cluster. Okay, but the idea is that firms tend to compete within their group, so it's important to identify what group you're involved in. Generally speaking, it's difficult to move within groups. There are barriers to mobility within groups, just similar to the barriers to entry in terms of the industry as a whole. So it's a very simple technique. It puts the industry down into a 2x2 matrix, and you can see immediately who's competing with who closely on the different dimensions. And you can see the size of the firms if you can indicate that as well. Gartner Group do this kind of analysis for the IT industry, and the next slide shows an example of that. And yep, that's it. I'll go on to the Gartner slide now. So they identify two dimensions under which they rate firms: the ability to execute and the completeness of the vision. And that then gives you obviously 4 quadrants then. Leaders, for example, being, pretty high in terms of their vision for the future and pretty high in their ability to execute in the present. Niche players tend to be small in terms of vision, and possibly, although no particular reason why a niche player should be poor at execution, but in this case, this is the way they've labeled it. You can see bottom right to top, bottom left to top right, the dots are more or less in a line here, which tells you really that only one dimension here would be sufficient. This is only a sample. It's not one of their actual graphs. You have to go and sign on to actually see their actual graphs for specific industries. But in this particular example, you can see top right to bottom left. So if you get that kind of thing happening, you probably should choose one. 2 dimensions here are giving you much the same information, so they're highly correlated. So you could change a dimension and give yourself some further information. One dimension here would probably be sufficient. And you can see here they just use dots. They don't use circles to show the size of the firm, but that's okay. It's giving quite a lot of information. And if you have a lot of firms in the industry, it gets very busy if you have large circles. So it's sometimes more, it's clearer to just show the dots, or the firms as dots. So that's the strategic group map. And from that now you should know, who you're competing with specifically, and indeed how strong you are on particular critical factors, critical success factors, and how strong your competitors are on those factors as well. And then the final slide is just looking at key success factors. So having examined your industry through from a macro level, pestle, economic trends, economic characteristics, and then at a slightly more detailed level, the industry's success factors, and then the competitors within the industry as the strategic group, or indeed you might do an individual competitor analysis of the individual competitors. Now you have a fairly good understanding of the nature of the industry, and you can draw your analysis to a conclusion by working out what are the key success factors in the industry. We've already used them, in fact, in the strategic group mapping. So what must go right in order to succeed in an industry? And it gives here 3 examples: utilization of capacity, distribution network, and clever advertising for the beer industry. So you can see those 3 capabilities underpinning these: the ability to use capacity, the ability to distribute well, and the ability to advertise. So these are capabilities that, in fact, a successful firm would probably want to have to compete in the beer industry. Concentrate on the most important factors. You don't need to list off 200 factors. Identify the small number, 3 to 6 critical factors, and be aware that these may change over time. A new technology may come in that makes some factors redundant and increases the value of another factor. So you need to keep an eye on these over time, okay? But they would be relatively long-lived, so they're not going to change every second week. All right, so that's the end of industry analysis. So thank you again. Thank you for listening.